All right. Chapter 4. Great chapter because there's lots of really good information and foundation material in this chapter. So keep in mind, I'm going to move through it at a nice, hopefully easy to understand, slow pace here. So let's start off by talking about, remember, first day of class, we talked about the levels of organization. And we just finished this. We're starting with the most simple level, and then we're going to advance on to the more complex levels. Well, atoms and molecules are the most simple level. Now we're going to go up to the next level, and that's going to be the cell. And so you're going to find out, taking anatomy and physiology, just how dependent certain body functions are on what the cells do. You're going to find out certain cells secrete stuff, certain cells absorb stuff, certain cells filter stuff. And so we're going to see the importance of these functions of these cells. So that's why I'll always tell folks when we're dealing with the cell, it is the smallest functional unit of the body. Right? And so we're going to go through and talk about the different parts of the cell. And then we're going to explain some of the functions of these parts. And hopefully that will give you a pretty decent understanding as to how, all right, a lot of these concepts that we're learning in this class, how they work, right? So just to review, the study of cells, we call that cytology. And this is a subdivision of microscopic anatomy because we need a microscope to look at these structures because they're too small for us to look at with the naked eye. Right, so there's different types of microscopes that we can use. What we have here at the school, or we have the light microscopes, but you have transmission microscopes, you have electron microscopes, right? And we're finding out, especially with the invention of the 3D technology now that we can use with microscopes, we're actually discovering structures to cells that we didn't know that existed. The latest one has to do with the immune function of a cell. And so we're still finding out, you know, what some of those functions are of these structures. So there's three parts to your cell. You're going to want to know all three of them, obviously. So you have the plasma membrane, the nucleus, and then cytoplasm. So the plasma membrane is going to be that outer part of the cell. And notice I underlined there, it says limiting barrier, okay? So what I mean by that is that the plasma membrane is responsible for the movement of substances entering into your cell and leaving your cell. And it's going to pretty much separate the internal part of your cell from the external environment. That's important. Because a lot of times, if the plasma membrane is compromised, and say there's holes that start to form in the plasma membrane for whatever reason, then the cell is most likely going to die. Right? So the plasma membrane plays a huge role. All right, so we'll see here with the plasma membrane, a lot of times on the outside, it can be just a regular plasma membrane, but we can also have some modifications to that plasma membrane. And some of those modifications, all right, or extensions could be these three things: cilia, which are like these hair-like appendages that wave back and forth, right? That can move things by a cell. And then you have the flagellum, and there's only one cell in the human body, all right, that contains the flagellum. And there's only one person in that room that has that cell, right? And that's me, male sperm. It's the only cell in the human body that contains the flagellum. It's that little tail-like structure that whips back and forth that propels the cell. And then finally, the microvilli are these extensions of the plasma membrane that help to increase surface absorption. And we'll talk about these later on. All right, the nucleus, which is often considered to be the control center of the cell. It's usually going to be in the middle of the cell there. And it has its own version of a plasma membrane, and that's the nuclear envelope. And so in the nucleus, we'll see some things of importance, but one of the main things that's very important in the nucleus is going to be the fact that it is going to contain your DNA, your instruction manual. Everything that's important in how to make you and make parts of you are going to be located in that DNA. So you've got the nucleus inside the cell, you've got the plasma membrane that is the external envelope that contains all the contents of the cell. And then finally, you have the cytoplasm, which is everything in between the plasma membrane on the inside and outside of the nucleus. So it's that space filler between those two structures there. Right? And so there's three parts to the cytoplasm. You have the cytosol, the organelles, and inclusions. And we're going to go through those. All right, so please know at least those three parts to your cell. We're going to go through all those. So let's start off talking a little bit about the cytoplasm. And so the cytoplasm has those three parts: cytosol, the organelles, and the inclusions. Another name, and you want to know this, you have to know this. The cytosol is like the fluid part of your cytoplasm, the liquidy component there. Another name for that is intra. Intra means within. The intracellular fluid, also known as ICF. So when you hear me say the intracellular fluid, I'm referring to the cytosol, which is in the cytoplasm, which makes the cytoplasm here. Right. So since I said it was like the liquid part, we're going to see lots of water. Lots of water. What else are we going to find? Remember what we said? We just learned about water, okay? Be a solvent. So in the cytosol, that water will have dissolved molecules inside of it. If it's something's water soluble, it can dissolve right into that. And we'll also see, all right, some ions: sodium, potassium, calcium, magnesium, all right? So we'll see several different types of ions that will also be found in the cytosol. All right, so just like in our bodies, we have organs, okay? Liver, heart, lung, stomach. Our cells have their own version of organs, except they're much smaller. So we call those the organelles, right? Or little organs. And we're going to discuss those next class most likely, all right? But we will see that a lot of these organelles are going to have unique functions, and you'll see that there is some complex structure to these organelles there. And so there's two types. Right? You have your membrane-bound and your non-membrane-bound organelles. Now, don't associate, when we say membrane, we're not talking about the plasma membrane here. Right? What we mean is some of these organelles have their own covering that goes around them. Right? And so that's a membrane. Some of them do not. Real simple, okay? So membrane-bound, they have that covering that goes around them. Because sometimes those organelles are doing things inside that, if whatever they were to be doing were released to the inside of the cell, it could be fatal. Lysosomes, for example, are these little bubbles that float around the cell, and they're filled with digestive enzymes. And in some cases, if those digestive enzymes were to spill out of the lysosome, they will start going after organelles in the plasma membrane, and they can damage the cell. So some of those organelles have to have a membrane around them, and some do not. Right? So essentially, those membrane-bound organelles, right, whatever their activity or functions are, they have to be isolated. Okay, they can't do it out in the open. And we'll go through all the different ones, all right? And endoplasmic reticulum, Golgi apparatus, and all that fun stuff. The non-membrane-bound obviously do not have a covering or membrane, and these predominantly are going to be made up of proteins. So when we talk about protein synthesis, right, you'll see that cells will make proteins that they can do a couple of things with. One of which, they can make proteins that they're going to ship out of the cell to go, maybe it's a hormone, and it's a protein hormone that it's going to ship out. Or maybe it needs to replace part of the plasma membrane. And then some proteins will stay within inside the cell. Maybe we have to repair or make a new organelle. And so we'll use those proteins to make those. Okay, so there's lots of different destinations for the proteins that our cells are making, right? And it's dependent on where those proteins are being made. And I'll get more into that, all right, when we get further along in this chapter. All right, so we'll talk about some of these organelles. All right, our third part of our cytoplasm are what we call inclusions. So we did cytoplasm, we did the cytosol, we did the organelles, and now the final part are the inclusions. It's kind of like the leftover stuff. But the big thing is, inclusions are only going to be staying around with us for a short period of time. They're not quite an organelle. All right, a perfect example is glycogen. Glycogen is the stored form of glucose. And so, again, glycogen is used constantly. We break it down to make glucose so we can use the glucose to make energy. All right? And then when we're in a fed state and we're all resting like we are now, your cells are going to take, all right, glucose and string it together to form the glycogen molecule and store it, right, inside of these cells for the next time when you need energy to do whatever. So some of these examples we'll see, all right, triglycerides, all right, pigments. When you get a tattoo, all right, some of that pigment can get into, all right, the cell itself. All right, so these inclusions, they come and go. Your cell is constantly replacing them for whatever reason. So this picture here is a good picture to look at, so you can kind of understand as we go through these structures here, you can get an appreciation. Here's the nucleus on the inside of the cell. Here's the plasma membrane, that outer limiting barrier there. And then everything in between is going to be the cytoplasm. So we have our liquidy parts, which is the cytosol. Then you have your organelles, all these different larger structures on the inside. And then you'll have inclusions like glycogen or triglycerides or whatever that are going to be kind of floating around in there too. And you can see some of the extensions here that come off the plasma membrane. Here, this big long guy, that's the flagellum. That's that structure that will whip back and forth that will propel the cell. And then you've got your cilia, these hair-like structures that just wave back and forth. You ever seen those wavy guys, those blow-up things by a car lot? All right, that's what flagella kind of, not flagella, but that's what the cilia kind of look like. They'll whip back and forth and they'll move stuff by the cell, like mucus, for example, right? You have cells that have flagella in your upper respiratory tract, and we're constantly moving. You ever wonder why you have that mucusy feeling, like especially in Greenville, if you have allergies, you know, you're coughing up and hacking up stuff, right? The cilia are pushing that stuff away from your lungs because it's better to be in your throat and in your mouth than in your lungs, right? So that's what the cilia are responsible for moving things. And then you've got your microvilli here, and they just help to increase the surface area of the cell for things like absorption. And we'll talk about those concepts later on. All right, let's just talk about a few of these things and we'll take a break. All right, so functions of the cell, and that's what we're going to be talking about a lot throughout this semester, is when we're talking about a certain subject, we'll talk about the characteristics of whatever it is we're studying, and then the functions of whatever it is that we're studying. So since we're talking about the cells, one of the first things that you see listed up here is maintain integrity in the shape of the cell. If cells start to lose their shape, that means they've lost their structural stability and their integrity. And most of the time, that means that cell is probably on its way if it hasn't died already. And so this is very, very important when we're dealing with the plasma membrane and some of the structures of which we haven't talked about yet on the inside of the cell, like the cell cytoskeleton. We have a skeleton in our body, right? Our bones, to help to give us form. If our bones were to magically disappear, we'd just be a blob of flesh. Well, our cells have what we call a cytoskeleton, and it helps to give structure to the cell. If that cytoskeleton were to leave, all right, that cell would just turn into a blob, and it would lose some functionality depending on what type of cell it is. All right, the next function is obtain nutrients and form chemical building blocks. You and I have to eat to live, right? And we use that food to help make things in our body and help with energy. Cell is no different, right? So it needs to obtain, all right, nutrients to help make energy, but also to make building blocks to make things, because maybe the cell is still growing, right? Or that cell has been damaged. So it has to do the same thing that we do. It has to get that, all right, that those building blocks, that energy from somewhere. And of course, just like us, right, we eat like a baby. Babies eat and they poop and they sleep. Well, all right, same thing. Cells do the same thing. They're going to eat, and then they're also going to poop. They're going to make wastes, and then they're going to get rid of it. And if they can't, then all those wastes start to build up inside the cell, and it becomes toxic to the cell, and most likely the cell could die if it's a long period of time. So it needs to get rid of those wastes. And then also, cells want to divide if they're able to. There's certain cells in your body that can divide, that can't, excuse me. An example would be your neurons, the cells that make up your nerves, right? They are what we refer to as amitotic. They can't divide. They will when you're developing as a fetus, right? But once you're born, you're pretty much going to have all the neurons, right? There's, of course, there's always exceptions to the rule. We'll discuss those later on, right? But for the most part, some cells cannot divide. And this is an example here, right? But obviously those that can, right, we're going to see, right, when they're dividing, what happens after they divide? They got to start to grow. So they need to actually do all of the above that we just talked about in order to grow. So what are the three main structural features of a cell? All right, remember that one slide I showed you? There was three things that make up what a cell is. Plasma membrane, nucleus, cytoplasm. Nailed it. Good job. Yep. Good. All right, perfect. This is a good place to stop. And then we will pick up here on our next class and talk about